Granny is a supernatural entity whom has been alive for a very long time, holding a specific grudge which leads her to punish her victims for presumable wrongdoings. Hi folks, I'm R, your narrator. This video will contain spoilers about Slenderman, Slenderina, and the Granny series. With that said, let's begin. I have already explained Granny 3, 2 and 1 in depth in a previous video, which you can watch by hitting the card above. If you have already done so, you can skip to the time indicated for endings explained. Granny has supernatural powers, making her immune to death, as no matter what method the protagonist uses, she wakes back up after a few minutes. In traditional folklore and legends, an entity called the White Lady is described as a powerful malevolent entity who lures or brings men to her house and punishes them severely before killing them. These men are usually people who have mistreated or abused women in their life. This entity used to be an abused woman herself who could have died in the hands of her abuser, whom then resurrects as a vengeful spirit, fueled by anger and revenge against those men who have abused women. Therefore, Granny seeks justice for those whom have been denied. Although this folklore bears close resemblance to Granny's backstory, there are some inconsistencies, as we don't know whether Granny was in fact abused or not, how she died, and how she selects her victims. The first game starts with the current victim waking up in a room in Granny's house, who finds writings and notes left behind from the previous victim of Granny. The protagonist learns that Granny likes to toy around with her victims, placing puzzles around the house, giving them 5 days of mental torture to solve them while having some hope of freedom, which allows Granny to fully break them physically and mentally before killing them. That is exactly what we find in a previous message left behind from the previous victim. The victim informs us how there are puzzles left around the house, which could eventually lead to freedom. But as days pass, the victim gives up, as every time he gets cut by Granny, he gets hit by a bat or taken back to the room. Exploring the house a bit more, this victim proves to be much more resilient than the previous ones, as he uncovers mysteries he wasn't supposed to. He learns about Granny's daughter, who was shackled to death, and Granny's granddaughter, Slenderina, who roams around as a ghost and presumably seeks her baby. I will not dive deep in their stories, as I have already explained it in the previous video. After finding a teddy bear the victim was not supposed to find, Granny becomes furious as seen by her glowing red eyes. Placing this teddy bear in a baby crib, the ghost of Slenderina shows up, assisting the victim to escape the house. There are 3 main endings, with the 4th one having a slight variation. The first 2 include Granny standing in front of the door in awe as the victim makes his escape. The 3rd one includes the Granny waiting behind the victim baffled as the victim uses the assembled car and makes his escape. All these 3 don't tell much about Granny and her backstory, other than that she is mentally tormented and likes to toy around with her victims. The final one, however, informs us a lot more about what she goes through mentally. In the 4th ending, we see Granny sitting on the porch, stroking the teddy bear, while the ghost of Slenderina shows up behind her. One thing we don't know for sure is whether Slenderina actually helps Granny in capturing and torturing her victims, and if they together plan the victim's demise, or whether Granny is unaware of Slenderina's ghostly presence. It is clear that Slenderina's soul is latched to the teddy bear, and she cares immensely about it, as she is present wherever the teddy bear is. It isn't canon whether this teddy bear belongs to Slenderina herself or her baby, but the theory that is to follow works with either. Granny seems to be a loving grandmother who cared very much about Slenderina. Slenderina has her own series and backstory, including her parents, husband, and child, which we will touch on briefly. We learn that Slenderina, including her parents, died in 1892 when her mother poisoned Slenderina and Slenderman. It's not clear if the mother also ate the poisoned food herself or not. But either way, she gets shackled by Granny as a form of punishment for killing Slenderina. It's clear that Granny cares about Slenderina very much, as she strokes the teddy bear at the end as if she is reminiscing on her memories of Slenderina. Slenderina appears behind her, with Granny not reacting, which could insinuate that Granny is not aware, or at least all the time, of Slenderina's presence. Granny herself seems to have somehow died, or at least had been affected by supernatural, making her immune to death and cutting her ties with the normal world, making her a vengeful entity, capturing and tormenting men, presumably. In Granny Chapter 2, yet another victim wakes up in a room of a new house from the previous one. Granny is accompanied by another vengeful entity who goes by the name of Grandpa. Grandpa wields a crowbar instead of a bat, which Granny has. Now they both hunt down the victims and torment them. As usual, puzzles are spread around for the victims to have a false sense of hope. It also seems that Granny changes her locations every time after the victims escape, maybe to evade being caught by authorities, so they can carry on tormenting people. In the second house, the victim finds a cage with a deformed child looking like a spider. The spider child eats meat, presumably flesh of Granny's victims, and uncooked meat, whom we later find out to somehow relate to Slenderina. It's not very clear if this child is created by Slenderina or born naturally, but it seems as if this child was somehow created by Slenderina and her vampire husband to possibly fill the void of Slenderina's late child. It is possible that Slenderina is inspired by yet another folklore malevolent entity, who is also called the White Lady, who lost her child whether in childbirth or afterbirth, and then ended her life in sorrow. She then resurrects as a vengeful spirit, looking for her child, hunting and killing anyone in her way. Slenderina might have created this child after the loss of her real child, to fill the void. Either way, harming the spider child in Granny 2 makes Slenderina to appear, with glowing red eyes. There is also a monstrous octopus that Granny and Grandpa are breeding. This monster is presumably used as means to guard the boat and prevent the victims from escaping. In Granny 2, there are 3 main endings, 2 of which show how well prepared Granny and Grandpa are. We can find a helicopter and a boat, which are both very functional. It's a little baffling how Grandpa and Granny got their hands on a helicopter, if not completely random, and for the sake of gameplay, it suggests that Granny and Grandpa are very influential. It's possible that they possibly just invaded someone's house, who probably were very stable financially, as they have CCTVs, a helicopter, and a boat. Granny and Grandpa possibly killed them in the process, taking their house to lure more victims in and kill. But if Granny and Grandpa procured these items, then it's possible that they have some sort of connection with other people who provided them with these items. In another ending, we see Granny sitting inside a car, which is suggestive of how she ambushes and captures her new victims. As suggested by the message left by a victim in Granny 1, we can conclude that Granny ambushes her victims, who are usually driving alone at night. She somehow places a trap to make their cars break down, and then hits them with a bat and takes them to her car and drives them to her new locations, which she changes frequently. The story of Grandpa is a little convoluted as how he fits in the story with Slenderina and Granny. Granny is concluded to have been possibly a victim of abuse herself and possibly died or obtained her supernatural powers like that. This made her to live for a very long time and be immune to death. She resurrects as a vengeful entity and in theory punishes men who have presumably mistreated and abused women. In the first game, she was alone, and the theory made sense. She also cared about Slenderina and held her teddy bear dear to herself, which fortifies the theory that she cared about women. But how does Grandpa fit in this theory? And where was he in Granny 1? If Granny was indeed abused by a man, it's possible the perpetrator was her husband. Therefore, it's possible that Grandpa is not actually Granny's husband, but is a random person, maybe Granny's brother, who also was resurrected by Granny in order to follow her cause. It's also possible that Granny killed her husband or whoever abused her, and resurrected them as a mindless slave to follow her cause. It gets a little twisted adding Grandpa to the mix, but I would also love to hear your take on this theory. In Granny 3, the protagonist, unlike the first two, walks into the new house of Granny by himself. He notices the camera at the gate and the collapsible bridge. He ignores them and tries to enter the house, while at the door, he gets shot by Grandpa. Then he's taken to the cellar, inside a cell. In there, the protagonist finds a skeleton, presumably of a previous victim, and decides to find a way to escape. This proves that Granny and Grandpa are not just after justice against abusive men anymore. Maybe after years of punishment, they became accustomed to their ways and enjoy tormenting and killing people. This is even further fortified as when the victim in Granny 1 returns the teddy bear to the crib and Slenderina decides to help him, Granny doesn't care and wants to torment the man. In Granny 3, the protagonist gets hunted by the ghost of Slenderina, who only stops after the protagonist returns the teddy bear at the crib again, just like Granny 1. There's only one main ending in Granny 3 by the time this video is made. When the protagonist manages to escape the premises, Granny and Grandpa stay outside of the house, looking around while the ghost of Slenderina appears from their behind. This ending is not suggestive of anything in particular, except for Granny and Grandpa thinking of moving out to a new location again, as this location became compromised. Although, a specific death ending is very interesting, when Granny places the victim inside the car and places a TNT there, while Grandpa and Granny stay near the car, while it explodes and hurts all three of them. Knowing that Granny and Grandpa are immune to death, it makes it difficult to believe that this TNT will permanently kill Grandpa and Granny. However, why would they hurt themselves on purpose? Is there a hidden meaning behind it? It can't be only for fun for Granny and Grandpa hurting themselves on purpose. Maybe it's a way for them to try and kill themselves. Maybe after all these years of tormenting and killing victims who they have lost count of and not sure whether they're guilty or not, they have enough. Maybe Granny and Grandpa do not want to live any longer, suffering the never-ending fate they have to withstand, taking the role of villains, tormenting unsuspecting victims. Maybe whatever conscience is left in Granny and Grandpa, they realize that they are reincarnated as vengeful entities, forever doomed to punish people, never being able to die, and finally rest. Let me know what are your thoughts about their backstory and this ending. This brings us to the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, you can stay tuned for the latest horror related videos by hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell. It's been your host Dar. Till the next video, have a fantastic day.